Bougainville Island, the South Pacific, 1944. If you watched the meticulously edited propaganda reels playing in stateside movie theaters, the Pacific War was a story of glorious Marine Corps amphibious assaults. They showed you brave, square-jawed combat infantry charging across pristine white beaches, planting flags, and pushing the enemy back in a clean, heroic march toward Tokyo. But out here, rotting in the suffocating, monsoon-drenched heart of the jungle, the reality of the war was entirely different. It was a miserable, disease-ridden nightmare of bottomless mud, rotting equipment, and a terrifying, invisible enemy that owned the shadows. Trapped at the bottom of a steep, violently excavated volcanic rock quarry was a detachment of the U.S. Navy Seabees, the legendary Naval Construction Battalions. They were a segregated unit of 40 African American heavy equipment operators and structural ironworkers. In the rigidly prejudiced military hierarchy of the 1940s, these men were not issued Thompson submachine guns or flamethrowers. They were handed heavy steel sledgehammers, massive iron chains, and high-pressure welding torches. Their only mission was to carve a secret B-29 bomber runway straight through a mountain of solid volcanic rock. But the frontline perimeter had just violently collapsed. Cutting silently through the dense, torrential rain of the jungle canopy, less than 40 minutes away was an elite raiding party of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, the Imperial Marines. 200 battle-hardened, deeply fanatical shock troops were descending the ridge, armed with Arisaka rifles, knee mortars, and razor-sharp bayonets. They were the undisputed apex predators of jungle warfare, moving like ghosts through the torrential monsoon, fully intent on slaughtering the American construction camp and seizing the heavy equipment. Standing directly at the bottom of the flooded, inescapable quarry, completely cut off from the main invasion force, were 40 exhausted, entirely unarmed construction workers. And as the distant, terrifying crack of sniper fire echoed through the jungle canopy, the American Naval Command stationed on the battleships offshore knew exactly what was about to happen. But they did not send a Marine rifle company to reinforce the perimeter. The High Command simply left them in the mud to die. Just 30 minutes before the Japanese Imperial Marines breached the jungle tree line, the flooded volcanic quarry was a scene of panicked, absolute betrayal. Idling in the churning, muddy water at the only river exit of the excavation site was the unit's only operational escape vehicle, a heavily armored, diesel-powered Higgins landing craft. Standing safely inside the steel-plated hull, aggressively wiping the tropical rain from his pristine, tailor-made waterproof officer's coat, was their commanding officer. He was a wealthy, aristocratic Navy lieutenant who viewed his assignment to a segregated African American construction battalion as a temporary, insulting stain on his naval career. Petty Officer Ark Washington, his thick canvas uniform entirely soaked through with freezing mud and machine grease, sprinted across the flooded quarry to the landing craft. He respectfully informed the lieutenant that the 40 Seabees needed to abandon the massive D-8 bulldozers and immediately board the armored boat. It was the only vehicle capable of safely navigating the flooded river and reaching the offshore destroyers before the Japanese shock troops slaughtered them all. But the lieutenant did not order the steel ramp lowered. In the rigidly prejudiced hierarchy of the 1944 Navy, the officer did not see 40 brave men who had spent weeks performing back-breaking labor to carve a strategic airfield out of solid rock. He saw 40 expendable laborers. He saw a fleshy roadblock. "You are a naval construction battalion, petty officer," the lieutenant shouted, his voice barely cutting through the roaring diesel engine of the Higgins boat. "Your explicit orders are to protect the heavy engineering equipment. You will not abandon those bulldozers under any circumstances." Washington gripped a heavy, forged steel wrench, his jaw locked tight. He explained, his deep voice carrying a terrifying, heavy clarity, that they were entirely unarmed. If an elite vanguard of Imperial Marines breached the quarry, sledgehammers and welding torches would be mathematically useless against Arisaka sniper rifles and knee mortars. The lieutenant's face flushed with a cowardly, defensive rage. He pointed a perfectly clean, trembling, gloved finger at the massive Chicago ironworker. "I must personally report this perimeter breach to the offshore command, petty officer. You will hold the line and protect the construction site. That is a direct order," the lieutenant screamed, completely ignoring the absolute, suicidal absurdity of his command. He did not hand them a single spare crate of M1 Garand rifles. He did not offer to stay and coordinate a defense. He simply turned his back, ordered his coxswain to gun the engine, and the heavy armored craft violently reversed into the river, disappearing into the blinding monsoon rain. The lieutenant explicitly, intentionally abandoned 40 unarmed men in a flooded, inescapable coffin, using their inevitable bloody slaughter to buy himself exactly 30 extra minutes to safely retreat to the fleet. In the cold, calculating mathematics of war, he looked at a map and decided that the construction workers were a perfectly acceptable speed bump. The heavy churning wake of the armored Higgins boat faded completely into the deafening roar of the tropical monsoon. The 40 African American Seabees stood knee-deep in the freezing, flooded mud of the quarry, looking at the empty river and then up at the dark, dense jungle ridge. They could hear the terrifying distinct snap of Japanese Arisaka rifles echoing through the canopy as the enemy overran the outer listening posts. Pust, the elite raiding party, was less than 40 minutes away. 2. They were entirely surrounded by sheer volcanic rock walls, completely out of ammunition, and mathematically dead. Panic, raw and unadulterated, began to paralyze the unit. Some men looked desperately at the sheer, muddy cliffs, contemplating a blind, suicidal climb into the endless jungle. But Petty Officer Ark Washington did not look at the jungle, and he did not panic. Washington was a massive, quiet man whose heavy hands were permanently scarred by white-hot slag and crushed steel. Before the draft board pulled his number, he had never read a military textbook on jungle warfare or infantry tactics. He was a master structural ironworker and welder who had spent his entire adult life suspended hundreds of feet in the air, connecting the colossal steel skeletons of Chicago high-rises. He was a blue-collar genius who intimately understood the terrifying, absolute laws of extreme structural tension, heavy machinery, and highly volatile industrial gases. Laws that the aristocratic, silver spoon naval officers completely ignored. While the terrified Seabees looked at the flooded quarry and saw a muddy graveyard, Washington looked through the pouring rain and saw a catastrophic industrial kill zone waiting to be armed. His intense, dark eyes scanned the massive, heavy-duty construction equipment scattered across the quarry floor. There were colossal, diesel-powered D8 bulldozers equipped with massive steel winches and thick, braided steel cables. And stacked securely on heavy wooden pallets under a canvas tarp were dozens of massive, reinforced steel cylinders filled with highly pressurized, pure acetylene gas. To the cowardly lieutenant who had abandoned them, acetylene was just a mundane logistical supply used for cutting rebar. But to a Chicago high-rise welder, pressurized acetylene was not a construction tool. It was one of the most violently unstable, highly combustible hydrocarbons on the face of the planet. Washington knew exactly what happened when heavy acetylene gas was released into an enclosed, low-lying area and introduced to a massive, high-kinetic friction spark. It did not just burn. It triggered a catastrophic, volumetric shockwave that would instantly liquefy human lungs and turn the entire quarry into a thermobaric oven. Washington slowly walked to the center of the flooded rock floor. He reached down and picked up a massive, 30-pound forged steel sledgehammer. He violently swung it against the heavy steel blade of a D8 bulldozer. The deafening, metallic clang cut completely through the monsoon rain, snapping the 40 terrified men out of their paralyzing panic. "Listen to me!" Washington roared, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the volcanic rock. "The brass wrote us off. They think we're just a bunch of ditch diggers holding shovels. They expect us to fight Imperial Marines with bullets we do not have. Washington wiped the freezing rain and mud from his scarred face, his gaze turning incredibly cold and completely focused. He pointed his heavy sledgehammer directly at the towering cylinders of volatile gas and the massive bulldozers. We are not going to do that. I am an ironworker, and we are going to fight them with heavy construction. For the next 20 terrifying minutes, the flooded volcanic quarry ceased to be a muddy, doomed graveyard. It transformed into a frantic, blindingly efficient industrial forge of desperate survival. The 40 African American Seabees did not scatter into the jungle. The paralyzing terror that had gripped them just half an hour before was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused mechanical rage. They were fighting for their right to exist, using the exact heavy-duty tools the military establishment had mocked them for holding. Following Petty Officer Washington's exact, calculated orders, the deafening roar of heavy diesel engines violently shattered the sound of the torrential monsoon. A dozen men sprinted to the massive, heavily armored D8 bulldozers. They did not move them to build a defensive wall. They drove the heaviest machine directly into the center of the flooded rock floor, burying its massive steel front blade deep into the unyielding volcanic mud. Then came the mechanical trap. Using massive, forged iron chains and heavy sledgehammers, Washington's men anchored one end of a thick, braided steel winch cable to the immovable, solid rock face of the quarry wall. They ran the other end directly to the heavy mechanical winch of the buried D8 bulldozer. Washington ordered the operator to throw the massive machine into reverse and engage the heavy steel winch to its absolute maximum capacity. The colossal diesel engine screamed under the unnatural load. The thick, braided steel cable violently lifted out of the mud, pulled completely taut across the center of the flooded quarry. It groaned with immense, unnatural kinetic tension, stretched to the absolute, terrifying edge of catastrophic structural failure. It was a massive, braying high-tension mechanical tripwire. Then came the chemical payload. Dozens of exhausted ironworkers formed a desperate braying, rapid-fire heavy lifting team. They hauled the massive braying, reinforced steel cylinders of highly pressurized, pure acetylene gas through the freezing mud. Using heavy iron pipe wrenches, they violently cracked the high-pressure brass valves wide open, permanently destroying the threading so they could not be closed, and hurled the screaming cylinders directly into the flooded, low-lying center of the quarry. In the torrential, suffocating rain, the invisible, highly volatile hydrocarbon gas did not float harmlessly into the open sky. The heavy atmospheric pressure of the tropical monsoon forced the incredibly unstable acetylene to pool perfectly across the flooded rock floor, violently mixing with the ambient air to create a massive, ground-hugging volumetric bomb. The entire flooded quarry was now an invisible, hypercombustible gas chamber, perfectly bisected by a colossal, screaming steel cable that was stretched to the absolute breaking point. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were entirely abandoned in a flooded jungle, surrounded by elite Imperial Marines, and all you had was a sledgehammer and highly volatile welding gas? Would you try to climb the muddy cliffs? Or would you trust a Chicago high-rise welder to build an impossible trap? Let me know exactly what you would do right now, because this industrial bomb is about to violently erase the enemy. Through the deafening, relentless roar of the tropical monsoon, the dark wall of the jungle canopy violently parted. The elite vanguard of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces had arrived. 200 battle-hardened Imperial Marines poured over the muddy ridge of the volcanic quarry, moving with terrifying, silent precision. Their uniforms were completely soaked, and the long, razor-sharp steel bayonets of their Arisaka rifles gleamed dully in the heavy rain, as they instantly fanned out to secure a perimeter. Standing at the very edge of the ridge, looking down into the flooded, bowl-shaped excavation site, was the Japanese commanding officer. He lowered his brass binoculars, his face twisting into a mask of pure, aristocratic confusion. There were no defensive trenches. There were no heavy machine gun nests. There was not a single American soldier in sight. Through the blinding rain, The commander saw only the massive yellow steel hulks of the D-8 bulldozers, their heavy diesel engines still roaring at a deafening idle. He saw a bizarre tangled mess of heavy steel chains, violently cracked welding cylinders sinking into the mud, and a single, thick winch cable pulled awkwardly across the center of the flooded rock floor, humming with unnatural mechanical tension. A slow, deeply arrogant smirk spread across the hardened commander's face. To the highly trained, elite jungle tactician, the scene was an absolute display of pathetic American cowardice and logistical incompetence. He assumed the terrified construction workers had simply panicked at the sound of the approaching sniper fire, blindly abandoned their multi-ton engineering equipment mid-task, and fled into the treacherous, endless jungle to die of exposure. He figured the screaming winch cable was just a stupid, panicked operator error, a machine left in reverse by a terrified driver. He scoffed loudly, a harsh, barking laugh of pure tactical contempt that cut completely through the noise of the roaring diesels. He barked a relaxed, aggressive order in Japanese, drawing his polished officer's katana and pointing it directly at the abandoned heavy machinery. The intense, lethal tension among the raiding party completely evaporated. The elite Imperial Marines lowered their rifles, their rigid combat discipline melting into arrogant victory. They began to casually slide down the muddy embankments into the flooded quarry, laughing, shouting to one another, and eagerly approaching the massive, running bulldozers to claim their mechanized prize. They were standing at exact ground zero, in the deepest, lowest point of the flooded basin. Because acetylene gas is completely invisible, and its faint, garlic-like odor was entirely masked by the thick, choking smell of the roaring diesel exhaust, the Japanese shock troops had absolutely no idea they were not walking through a deserted construction site. They were wading waist-deep into a massive, concentrated lake of highly volatile, hypercombustible hydrocarbon gas. And hidden perfectly in the deep, muddy shadows of the rock face directly above the tensioned cable, Petty Officer Ark Washington gripped the heavy, forged steel manual brake lever of the D-8's mechanical winch. His scarred hands were completely steady. The trap was locked. To the arrogant Japanese commander, the terrifying metallic shrieking of the overstressed winch cable was just the sound of broken American machinery. He wiped the torrential monsoon rain from his face, completely ignoring the terrifying industrial science of the trap he and his elite troops had just walked blindly into. In standard industrial welding, acetylene gas is highly regulated because it is one of the most violently unstable hydrocarbons on Earth. Unlike standard propane or natural gas, acetylene possesses an incredibly wide explosive limit. It can ignite violently when mixed with anywhere from 2.5% to a staggering 82% of air. By violently shattering the high-pressure brass valves and flooding the low-lying, bowl-shaped rock quarry, Petty Officer Washington had completely bypassed the safety regulators. Because the heavy tropical rain and intense atmospheric pressure of the monsoon acted as a natural lid, the invisible acetylene did not dissipate. It perfectly blanketed the flooded rock floor, violently mixing with the ambient oxygen to form a massive, highly unstable fuel-air matrix. In the civilian world, an uncontrolled acetylene leak of this magnitude in an enclosed space is an absolute, catastrophic death sentence. The invisible gas requires incredibly low ignition energy to detonate. A simple static shock from a worker's boot is enough to trigger a devastating explosion. Washington had meticulously engineered a macroscopic, volumetric bomb, and he did not need a tiny static shock. He had built a colossal, mechanical friction detonator. The thick, braided steel winch cable of the D-8 bulldozer, pulled to the absolute limits of its structural integrity, was a massive kinetic spring holding tens of thousands of pounds of raw mechanical force. When heavy braided steel is violently snapped under that level of extreme tension, the kinetic energy is instantly converted into thermal friction. The violently whipping steel strands behave like a colossal, high-velocity flint, creating a blinding, hyperthermal shower of molten steel sparks. The elite Imperial Marines were literally wading chest deep in a highly volatile, invisible powder keg. All that was missing was the match. Down in the flooded mud, the Japanese commander finally noticed the intense, sickeningly sweet, garlic-like odor of the raw acetylene cutting entirely through the thick diesel exhaust. He abruptly stopped laughing, his eyes widening in sudden, terrifying realization, and he frantically screamed for his men to fall back to the ridge. He was exactly 1 second too late. From the dark, muddy shadows of the rock face just above the cable, Petty Officer Washington looked down at the heavily armed killers. He did not have a machine gun. He did not need one. He violently slammed a heavy iron sledgehammer directly into the bulldozer's mechanical winch brake lever, instantly releasing the lock on the massive, overstressed steel cable. The heavy forged iron sledgehammer violently smashed into the rusted mechanical brake lever, completely shattering the locking mechanism. The colossal, unnatural kinetic tension held by the D8 bulldozer's winch was instantly and catastrophically released. The thick, braided steel cable did not just snap, it violently shredded itself under the immense, unyielding laws of physical stress. As tens of thousands of pounds of raw mechanical force were instantly unleashed, the violently whipping strands of heavy steel whipped through the flooded air at supersonic speeds, striking the solid volcanic rock face. The immense friction instantly converted the kinetic energy into pure, blinding thermal heat. A massive, hyperthermal shower of molten steel sparks violently erupted across the exact center of the flooded quarry. The blinding cascade of molten steel fell directly into the invisible, ground-hugging lake of highly volatile acetylene gas. The fundamental, terrifying laws of industrial thermodynamics took absolute control. It was not a localized, rolling fire. It was an instantaneous, catastrophic, volumetric detonation. A blinding, impossible flash of pure, hyperthermal blue-white plasma violently eradicated the heavy monsoon rain. The ignition flash baked the massive, invisible fuel-air matrix simultaneously. Because acetylene burns hotter than almost any other combustible gas on Earth, the resulting supersonic shockwave of raw, unadulterated kinetic energy and heat slammed into the elite Japanese shock troops with the crushing, inescapable force of a volcanic eruption. The physics of the flooded basin were completely merciless. The heavy water and unyielding rock walls directed the colossal thermobaric shockwave entirely inward and upward. The expanding pressure wave traveled faster than the speed of sound, violently lifting the battle-hardened Imperial Marines entirely off their feet, rendering their razor-sharp bayonets and Arisaka rifles completely useless. But the kinetic crushing force was only the first half of the execution. The colossal blue-white fireball violently expanded, instantly consuming every single molecule of oxygen within the flooded rock walls. It created a massive, localized mechanical vacuum, while the hyperthermal flash boiled the flooded mud beneath their boots. The apex predators of the Pacific, men who had ruthlessly conquered impenetrable jungles, were instantly neutralized by the terrifying realities of heavy construction. They were simultaneously incinerated by the welding plasma and suffocated by the absolute atmospheric void left in its wake. The colossal, blinding flash snapped out of existence almost as quickly as it had erupted, leaving behind a deafening, ringing silence, entirely undisturbed by the falling tropical rain. Deep in the muddy shadows of the rock face high above the blast zone, Petty Officer Ark Washington and the 40 African American Seabees slowly stood up. 40 abandoned, completely unarmed construction workers had just weaponized heavy machinery and welding gas to entirely erase an elite Imperial Marine raiding party from the face of the earth. 4 agonizing hours after the catastrophic volumetric detonation, the relentless tropical monsoon finally broke, leaving behind a thick, suffocating morning mist. The dense canopy of Bougainville Island dripped with humidity, but the flooded volcanic quarry was completely, terrifyingly silent. Cutting through the dense jungle river was the heavy, rhythmic churning of an armored Higgins landing craft returning to the excavation site. Standing safely behind the thick steel plating of the boat was the pristine, aristocratic Navy lieutenant. He had spent the entire night miles offshore, drinking hot coffee in the wardroom of a heavily fortified destroyer. He was returning to the quarry with a platoon of heavily armed Marine reinforcements, fully expecting to find a butchered, blood-soaked graveyard of 40 expendable construction workers. He had already mentally drafted the sanitized after-action report, prepared to commend their heroic sacrifice, while entirely omitting the fact that he had explicitly abandoned them to save his own skin. But as the heavy steel ramp of the landing craft splashed down into the muddy riverbank, the lieutenant's polished boots stopped dead in the water. The quarry was not a graveyard of American laborers. It was a violently terraformed, scorched crater of flash-baked volcanic rock and boiling mud. The immense thermobaric shockwave had completely leveled the surrounding jungle tree line, snapping massive mahogany trunks like toothpicks. The deep, flooded water of the basin was still violently steaming from the hyperthermal plasma flash, and scattered across the blackened glass-like surface of the blasted rock were the neutralized remains of the elite Japanese Imperial Marines. They had not been shot. They had been entirely eradicated by a catastrophic thermal flash and sheer atmospheric vacuum pressure. The lieutenant's jaw dropped in absolute paralyzing disbelief. He stepped tentatively into the blast zone, his elite Marine escorts gripping their M1 Garens in sheer awe. And then, stepping slowly out from the deep, muddy shadows of the rock face, came the phantoms. One by one, the 40 African American Seabees stepped into the morning light. They were completely covered in thick black soot, freezing mud, and the unmistakable stench of burned hydrocarbon gas. They were exhausted, their muscles completely drained by the extreme, sustained adrenaline of their impossible survival. But they were entirely, undeniably alive. Petty Officer Ark Washington, his massive frame towering over the smoldering, snapped remnants of the braided steel cable, wiped a thick layer of toxic ash from his scarred face. He stared directly through the cowardly officer. He did not salute. He just held his heavy, forged iron sledgehammer. "Quarry secured, Lieutenant," Washington's deep, gravelly voice cut through the humid morning air. "Enemy raiding party has been entirely neutralized." The lieutenant stared at the massive Chicago ironworker, his aristocratic face flushing a violent, defensive crimson. He looked at the apocalyptic destruction of the basin, and then at the unarmed builders holding sledgehammers and heavy iron chains. "What in God's name happened here, petty officer?" the lieutenant stammered, his voice laced with sudden, terrified panic. "Did a Navy Corsair squadron drop a heavy payload off target? Did a Japanese ammunition cache detonate?" "No bombers, sir," Washington replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble of pure working-class fury. "We deadlocked a D8 winch, flooded the basin with unvalved, high-pressure acetylene gas, created a massive mechanical friction spark with a snapped steel cable, and triggered a volumetric plasma detonation. We burned the air." The lieutenant stared at Washington in absolute, sickening denial. The mathematical brilliance of the trap, the fact that a segregated, blue-collar welder had engineered a highly complex, supersonic, thermobaric explosion using nothing but construction equipment and raw physics, fundamentally shattered his deeply prejudiced worldview. Acknowledging that genius would completely humiliate him and his prestigious Naval Academy training. "You expect me to believe a squad of uneducated ditch diggers built a volumetric bomb in the mud?" the lieutenant spat, his voice echoing with absolute, arrogant dismissal. "That is scientifically absurd." A stray mortar shell obviously hit a volatile gas pocket from the volcanic vent. It was a freak accident of the island. Washington's jaw locked tight. The 39 men behind him froze, the crushing, suffocating weight of the profound betrayal settling over them in the sweltering heat. They had commanded the terrifying, invisible chemistry of industrial gases, annihilated an elite apex predator without firing a single bullet, and survived the darkest, most claustrophobic nightmare of the Pacific War. And the cowardly establishment was about to violently erase every single second of it. You maliciously destroyed thousands of dollars of vital United States military engineering equipment and deliberately sabotaged critical industrial supplies, the lieutenant roared, his voice dripping with aristocratic venom, completely ignoring the sheer impossibility of the Seabees' survival, or the apocalyptic graveyard of Imperial Marines around them. He turned frantically to his heavily armed Marine escorts, who were staring at the violently flash-baked, glass-like surface of the blasted rock in absolute awe. "Confiscate their tools immediately! Arrest Petty Officer Washington!" the lieutenant barked, completely erasing the heroism of the construction battalion to protect his own shiny brass insignia. "I am charging him with gross negligence, dereliction of duty, and the willful, unauthorized destruction of government property." The Marines nervously leveled their M1 Garands at the 40 exhausted men who had just saved the entire American beachhead from a devastating jungle ambush. The betrayal was absolute, crushing, and infinitely deeper than the freezing mud of the quarry. They had looked at a flooded, inescapable tomb, weaponized the terrifying, invisible chemistry of industrial gases and structural tension, and entirely annihilated an elite vanguard of apex predators. And their only reward was to be stared down by the guns of their own commanders. Their unimaginable, physics-defying tactical genius completely erased, stolen, and buried by the very establishment that had left them in the mud to die. This is the exact reason you will never find the name Ark Washington or the acetylene Phantom in your standard World War II history textbooks. The Allied High Command completely sanitized the official after-action reports. The catastrophic destruction of the elite SNLF Vanguard was officially classified as a mass casualty event caused by an accidental detonation of an abandoned Japanese ammunition cache. The 40 brave blue-collar ironworkers of the Naval Construction Battalion were quietly split up and shipped to other forgotten logistical details, their records permanently sealed, and their incredible, working-class brilliance completely buried beneath mountains of redacted, classified paperwork. But the truth is permanently scorched into the violently flash-baked volcanic rock of Bougainville. The truth lives in the calloused, slag-scarred hands of the working-class men who actually bleed in the deepest, muddiest corners of the earth, while the cowards at the very top steal all the glory and hide the evidence. Tell me in the comments, have you ever pulled off the absolute impossible at your job, saving a massive project from complete disaster, only to have a toxic, arrogant manager entirely steal your credit? Or worse, try to punish you for the exact way you fixed it? Flood the comment section with your stories right now, because exposing the truth is the only way we honor the ghosts of the jungle Seabees.